Today we are going to talk about modern genetics. Open your books at page 8. Let's listen and repeat the new words. Open your vocabularies and write them down.
Axial,
constricted,
gamete, genotype,
heredity,
heterozygous, homozygous, phenotype, pod, primary model system,
seed,
segregation,
selective breeding,
stem, terminal,
variance, variation,
Let's start with exercise 1. Now look at the diagram and fill in the words stem, pod, seed, flower. You are to define character, dominant and recessive traits. Let's check your answers. Listen and repeat.
seed shape, seed color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, stem height.
In exercise 2, you are to answer the questions. Who is Gregor Mendel? What do you know about his experiments on pea plants? Why is he considered the father of genetics? Read the text to find out.
Gregor Mendel is a scientist who carried out experiments using pea plants to demonstrate the inheritance of traits. He discovered how traits were passed from one generation to the next, and came up with laws of inheritance that explain his findings. He is considered the father of genetics because his work has helped us to understand how genetic information is passed down between generations.
Now let's watch the video.
Mendel's peas. Inheritance explained. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk and scientist who conducted experiments about variation in plants. He chose to study the pea plant as his primary model system to study heredity because it grows quickly, produces many seeds, and it can either self-pollinate or cross-pollinate with another plant. His experiments allowed him to discover fundamental principles of inheritance, which also apply to people and other animals. Mendel was curious what determined variance. He decided to look at 7 different pea plant traits: height, seed color, seed shape, pod color, pod shape, flower position, and flower color. He used selective breeding to observe these traits over many generations. Mendel quickly discovered that by breeding a homozygous plant with yellow pea seeds and a homozygous plant with green pea seeds, the first offspring generation were heterozygous, yet always had yellow seeds. That is, they inherited a Y, yellow, dominant allele from one parent and a Y, green, recessive allele from the other. This meant that they had a 50-50 chance of passing on one or the other alleles to each individual offspring. The next generation, however, always had a ratio of 3 yellow to 1 green. Based on a mathematical analysis of the results of his experiments, he was confident to reach 3 conclusions. First, each trait is dependent on genes which are passed on unchanged. Second, one gene for each trait is inherited from each parent. Thirdly, some traits may not be apparent in an individual, but can be passed on to the next generation. He also concluded that the genotype is always more important than the phenotype when it comes to heredity.
And do exercise 3. Read the text again. Mark the sentence as true, false, and doesn't say. Gregor Mendel was the first person to study genetics. There is no information in the text. He didn't choose to study the pea plant at random. It is true. Let's check. All of the first generation of pea plants showed a particular trait. It is true. Look at the text. One of his conclusions was that the genes change when they were passed on. It is false. It is said in the text that each trait is dependent on genes which are passed on unchanged. Mendel's paper Experiments in Plant Hybridization was quite popular when first published. It is false because the scientific community took no notice of his work until 30 years later. Exercise 4 is devoted to collocations. There are two or more words that often go together. Listen and repeat.
Offspring generation. Variation in plants. Selective breeding. Dominant allele. Primary model system. Fundamental principles of inheritance. The first offspring generation in Mendel's experiments were heterozygous. Mendel conducted experiments on variation in plants. He used selective breeding. Dominant alleles tend to be expressed more often. Mendel's primary model system was the pea plant. Mendel discovered the fundamental principles of inheritance.
Now let's do exercise 5. You are to choose the correct item. Write down the sentences. In exercise 6, you are to listen some information about Mendel's laws of inheritance.
Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk who performed experiments on pea plants in order to understand genetic inheritance. He chose pea plants because they grew quickly and had various observable traits. From his series of experiments, Mendel came to 3 conclusions. He called these the laws of inheritance.
The first law states that when gametes are formed, they only contain one randomly selected allele for each gene from the parents.
The second law explains that the genes we inherit for different traits are inherited independently of one another, and these are unchanged. This is why we have some parts that are more similar to our mother and parts more similar to our father.
The third law explains that for each gene there are a number of alleles, and some alleles are dominant over others. This means that if the offspring inherits 2 different alleles for a particular trait, only the dominant one will be expressed in the organism. But this doesn't mean that the recessive allele cannot be passed on to the next generation.
Mendel's work was our first real understanding of genetics, which is why he became known as the father of genetics.
And now let's speak about adjective complements. An adjective complement is a phrase that gives extra information about an adjective. It can be an infinitive phrase or a noun clause. The types. Infinitive phrases consist of to plus the base form of the verb and any modifiers or objects that relate to the verb. For example, I am very pleased to meet you. We were interested to learn about heredity. Noun clauses function as nouns. They have a subject and a verb, but they aren't complete sentences. A noun clause starts with that, how, if, what, when, why, whether, etc. For example, I am disappointed that I failed the test. He was upset when his laptop broke down. Now let's find these complements in the text. He was happy that he was able to study. Mendel was curious about what determined variance. He was confident to reach 3 conclusions. It was said that the scientific community took no notice. In the 8th exercise, you are to match the 2 columns to form complete sentence. Write them down in your copybooks as it is given in the example.